The first-class cabin buzzed with the hum of wealth, designer bags cramming the bins, cologne mingling with freshly brewed coffee, and the faint glow of screens flashing stock prices. James Carver sank into his seat, a smug grin tugging at his lips. He'd earned this spot, unlike the young blonde slipping into the seat beside him. Karoline Leavitt, mid-20s, no flashy labels, just a tablet and a quiet confidence that irked him instantly. "Daddy's money, huh?" he muttered, loud enough to sting. She didn't flinch. Who was she, really? Another spoiled kid coasting on privilege? Or something more? The truth was about to hit him like a freight train, and he'd regret every word. Have you ever misjudged someone at first glance? Stick around, because this flight's twist will make you question everything, and we'd love to hear your own stories in the comments below. The flight from Washington, D.C. to Tampa was packed. The first-class cabin a tight squeeze of egos and privilege. The air carried a whiff of expensive cologne and fresh coffee, the kind of scent that screamed money without saying a word. James Carver settled into his window seat, loosening his tie with a satisfied sigh. At 50, he'd clawed his way up from nothing. Decades of late nights, cheap suits, and relentless hustle had landed him here. He belonged in first class, earned it with every drop of sweat. The woman sliding into the seat beside him, not so much. She was young, mid-20s maybe, blonde hair pinned back neatly, dressed in a simple black blazer and white top. No jewelry, no designer bag, just a slim tablet she powered on without a glance his way. Karoline Leavitt, though he didn't know her name yet, didn't fit his mental checklist of who deserved to sit here. James sized her up in seconds. Another trust fund kid. Probably sipping champagne on her parents' dime, while he'd spent years scraping by. He smirked, shaking his head. The nerve of some people. "Must be nice," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. She didn't react, her eyes fixed on her tablet. That annoyed him. People usually noticed when James Carver spoke. Clients, colleagues, even strangers on planes. He'd built a career reading rooms, spotting winners and losers at a glance, and this girl? She screamed loser, privileged, untested, coasting through life. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I bet your parents are real proud, getting their little girl a first-class seat like this." Karoline's fingers paused over her screen. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry, what?" Her tone was flat, not defensive, not irritated, almost like he was a buzzing fly she hadn't decided to swat yet. It threw him off. James chuckled, doubling down. "You heard me. First class isn't cheap. What'd you do to earn it? Or did Daddy just swipe his card?" Her expression didn't shift. "I'm working," she said simply, then went back to her tablet. "Working?" James snorted. Sure, probably scrolling Instagram or planning her next beach vacation. He'd seen her type before, young, entitled, floating through life while people like him fought for every inch. He'd started as a nobody, a kid from a nowhere town with no connections, no handouts. Years of grinding through sales gigs, charming difficult clients, and outsmarting competitors had gotten him here. Meanwhile, this girl waltzed in like she owned the place. He shifted in his seat, irritation simmering. "Work? What kind of work does a kid like you do that lands you here?" His voice carried now, sharp enough to draw a few glances from nearby passengers. Karoline didn't bite. She tapped something on her screen, her focus unwavering. That only fueled him more. "Let me guess, shopping sprees don't count as a job, right? Or maybe you're one of those influencers." "That's it, isn't it?" She sighed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a faint exhale, and set her tablet on her lap. "I don't think you'd understand my job," she said, her voice calm but edged with something he couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. James bristled. "Try me," he shot back. "I've been around the block. I know a fake when I see one." Karoline raised an eyebrow, studying him for a beat. "Okay," she said, almost like she was humoring him. "I deal with people who ask tough questions all day. I'm used to it." She picked up her tablet again, dismissing him without another word. James blinked. Tough questions? What was that supposed to mean? Some corporate intern playing cryptic? He wasn't buying it. "Nice dodge," he muttered, leaning closer. "But seriously, what's a girl like you doing in first class? Weekend getaway on someone else's dime?" His tone was mocking now, a jab meant to provoke. She didn't flinch. "No," she replied, eyes still on her screen. "I'm headed to Tampa for a meeting." "A meeting." "Right." James rolled his eyes. "Sure you are. Hope it's not too taxing. Wouldn't want to ruin your manicure." That got a reaction. Just a flicker, a tiny tightening of her jaw. She turned to him fully this time, her gaze steady. "You don't know me," she said, not loud, not harsh, but firm enough to make him pause. James smirked, undeterred. "I don't need to. I've met plenty of spoiled brats pretending they belong here. You're not fooling anyone." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Karoline tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Not warm, not friendly, just knowing. "We'll see," she said, and turned back to her work. James frowned. "We'll see? What the hell did that mean?" He opened his mouth to push further, but something about her calm, unshaken demeanor stopped him. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't even annoyed, and that, more than anything, made him uneasy. He'd find out soon enough who she really was, and when he did, every smug word he'd just thrown at her would come crashing back. James Carver wasn't used to being ignored. He'd spent decades commanding attention. Whether it was in boardrooms or bar rooms, people listened when he talked. So, when Karoline Leavitt brushed him off with that cool, detached, "I'm working" line, it didn't just irk him, it lit a fuse. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under him, and fixed her with a hard stare. She didn't even look up, her fingers tapping away on that damn tablet like he was invisible. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. He called her out, pegged her as some rich kid playing pretend, and she was supposed to squirm, stammer, maybe even snap back. "Not this." "Not nothing." "You're working," he repeated, his voice low and mocking, testing the waters. "Right. What's that mean, exactly? Booking spa days for Mommy and Daddy's next vacation?" He smirked, waiting for a crack in her armor. Karoline didn't bite. She kept her eyes on her screen, her expression as steady as it'd been when she sat down. "I'm preparing for something," she said, clipped and matter-of-fact, like she was explaining the weather to a stranger. "Preparing for something." James snorted. "Yeah? What's a little princess like you preparing for? Your next selfie?" Her fingers paused, just for a split second, but she didn't look at him. "Something important?" she said, then resumed typing. "Important? That was it?" James felt the heat creeping up his neck. She wasn't giving him anything. No argument, no defense, just these vague, infuriating non-answers. He leaned closer, his voice rising a notch. "Come on, don't be shy. What do you do to earn a seat like this? Or is it all just spending someone else's money?" He spat the words out, sharp and deliberate, loud enough that the guy 2 rows up glanced over his shoulder. Karoline finally turned her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were calm, too calm, and it made his stomach twist in a way he didn't expect. "I told you," she said evenly. "I'm working." Then she went back to her tablet, dismissing him again. James clenched his jaw. Working. That was her shield, her little dodge, and he wasn't buying it. He'd met plenty of pampered brats in his time, kids who thought a trust fund and a pretty face could buy them respect. This girl with her plain blazer and no-name vibe was just another one. Except she wasn't acting the part. She wasn't flustered or defensive. She was unbothered. And that pissed him off more than anything. "You're a real piece of work, you know that?" he said, his tone sharpening into something uglier. "A spoiled little brat sitting here like you own the place? What's your deal? Daddy's credit card get you this far? Or did you charm some sugar daddy into footing the bill?" He raised his voice now, letting it carry, wanting it to sting. A woman across the aisle, older, maybe 60, with silver-streaked hair and a crisp blazer, frowned slightly but didn't say anything. Helen Grayson, though James didn't know her name yet, adjusted her glasses and kept her eyes on her magazine, clearly listening. Karoline didn't flinch. She tapped something on her tablet notes, he could see now, dense blocks of text about immigration stats and policy points, and said, "You're loud." It wasn't an insult, just an observation, but it landed like a slap. James blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" he snapped. She glanced at him, her expression still neutral. "You're loud," she repeated, "and I'm trying to focus." "Focus? On what?" He squinted at her screen. Something about border security, Trump's latest push in Tampa, a press briefing tomorrow. It didn't click yet. To him, it was just gibberish. Some intern's busy work. Loud? He scoffed, leaning back with a bitter laugh. Oh, I'm sorry, Your Highness. Didn't mean to disturb your very important... whatever this is. He waved a hand at her tablet, his voice dripping with disdain. Let me guess. You're some assistant fetching coffee for the real players, right? Or maybe you're just killing time till the trust fund kicks in. He was on a roll now, his words tumbling out faster, sharper, meant to humiliate her in front of everyone. A few more heads turned. The guy 2 rows up muttered something to his seatmate. Helen Grayson's frown deepened, her fingers tightening on her magazine. Karoline set her tablet down, not fast, not angry, just deliberate, and looked at him fully. You really want to know what I do? She asked, her voice steady but with a faint edge, like she was daring him to keep going. James smirked, sensing an opening. Yeah, I do. Enlighten me. What's a kid like you got going on that's so damn important? He crossed his arms, smug, ready to tear apart whatever flimsy excuse she threw his way. She held his gaze for a beat, then shrugged. I deal with people like you all the time, she said. Loud, pushy. Sure, they've got everyone figured out. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm used to it. Then she picked up her tablet again, like he wasn't worth another second. James's smirk faltered. People like him? What the hell was that supposed to mean? His pulse kicked up, irritation boiling into something hotter. You think you're clever, huh? He shot back, louder still. Some snotty little girl acting like she's above me? I've earned this seat. Every damn penny. What have you done besides bat your eyelashes? The cabin went quiet. Even the low hum of chatter died down. Helen Grayson finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied James, then Karoline. The guy 2 rows up turned fully in his seat, watching now. James didn't care. He wanted a reaction. Anger, tears, anything to prove he was right about her. Karoline didn't give it to him. She tapped her screen again, more notes, something about asylum numbers, and said, You're still loud. It was so simple, so unbothered, that it felt like a punch. His face burned. Keep talking, she added, almost offhand. You'll figure it out eventually. Figure what out? He barked, his voice echoing now. That you're a nobody with a fancy ticket? I've met 100 girls like you, entitled, clueless, riding someone else's coattails. He was shouting and he knew it, but he couldn't stop. The whole cabin was watching, Helen Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, the guy 2 rows up, shaking his head. Karoline just sighed again, scrolling through her notes. If you say so, she said, and that was it. No fight, no fire, just those 4 words that made him feel small, without even trying. James sat back, breathing hard, his chest tight with fury. She wasn't breaking, she wasn't even playing the game, and that made him want to push harder, to crack her open, to prove he wasn't wrong. He opened his mouth again, ready to let loose, when Helen Grayson cleared her throat, a sharp, pointed sound that cut through the tension like a knife. James froze, his words caught in his throat. Karoline didn't look up, but a tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lip. She knew something he didn't, and soon, he'd know it too. James Carver's tirade hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking, but Karoline Leavitt didn't budge. Her calm was a wall he couldn't crack, and it drove him nuts. He was gearing up for another jab, his mouth half open, when a new voice cut through the tension. Sarah, the flight attendant, a tall brunette with a clipboard and a polite smile, paused at their row. She glanced at Karoline, and her face lit up with recognition. Miss Leavitt, she said, her tone warm and reverent. It's such an honor to have you on this flight. That speech you gave at the White House last week, it was incredible. The words hit James like a brick. He froze, his next insult dying on his tongue. Miss Leavitt, White House? Speech? His brain scrambled to catch up, but nothing clicked yet. He stared at Sarah, then at Karoline, who offered the flight attendant a small, gracious nod. Thank you, she said simply. I appreciate that. Sarah lingered for a second, beaming, before moving down the aisle. James blinked, his pulse thudding in his ears. Leavitt? The name tugged at something buried in his memory. News clips, maybe, or a headline he'd skimmed over coffee. But he couldn't place it, not yet. He turned to Karoline, his smirk gone, replaced by a frown. What was that about, he asked, his voice quieter now, uncertain. She didn't answer right away, just tapped something on her tablet, those damn notes again, and kept her eyes down. Nothing, she said, casual as ever. Nothing? James's jaw tightened. That wasn't nothing. The flight attendant didn't gush over random nobodies. He opened his mouth to press her, but before he could, Helen Grayson, the silver-haired woman across the aisle, set her magazine down with a deliberate thud and leaned forward. "You really don't know who she is, do you?" Helen said, her voice crisp, laced with amusement and a hint of disdain. James shot her a look, irritation flaring. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. Helen adjusted her glasses, peering at him like he was a puzzle missing half its pieces. "That's Karoline Leavitt," she said, nodding toward the young woman beside him. "Not just any White House press secretary, the youngest in history. Took the podium at 27, faced down the toughest reporters in the country, and didn't blink. Oh, and she ran Trump's 2024 campaign press strategy. She didn't need anyone to buy her a ticket, Mr. Loudmouth. She earned it." The cabin went still. James's stomach dropped, a cold, heavy weight settling in his gut. Karoline Leavitt. The name clicked now, flashes of TV footage, her standing behind that podium, fielding brutal questions with a steady voice and sharper answers. He'd seen her before, maybe on a muted screen in some airport lounge, but she'd been a blip, a footnote he'd ignored. Now she was sitting next to him, and he'd just spent the last half hour calling her a spoiled brat. His throat went dry. He glanced at her, hoping, praying, she'd contradict it, laugh it off, say it was a mix-up. She didn't. She just kept working, her fingers moving over her tablet like nothing had happened. The guy 2 rows up chuckled, low and smug. A woman behind them whispered something to her seatmate. The whole damn plane was in on it now, and James felt the spotlight burning into him. Helen wasn't done. "You know," she added, her tone cutting, "she didn't come from money either, no silver spoon, no handouts, just brains and grit. Funny how you assumed otherwise." James's face heated up, the sting of her words sinking deep. He shifted in his seat, the leather suddenly too tight, too hot. He'd been so sure, dead certain she was some trust fund kid. Now he looked like an idiot, and everyone knew it. "I didn't," he started, his voice hoarse, scrambling for a foothold. "I mean, I couldn't have known. She doesn't even look like—" He stopped, realizing too late how stupid he sounded. Helen raised an eyebrow. "Like what? A big shot? Someone important?" She smirked, enjoying this way too much. James swallowed hard, turning to Karoline. "You could have said something," he muttered, defensive now. "How was I supposed to guess?" Karoline finally looked up, her gaze steady, unreadable. "Not everyone needs to flaunt it to prove their worth," she said, her voice calm but firm, like she was stating a fact she'd learned years ago. It wasn't a jab, not exactly, but it cut deeper than anything Helen had thrown at him. James flinched. She was right, and he hated it. He'd spent his life sizing people up by their clothes, their swagger, their loudness. Karoline didn't fit that mold, and he'd misread her completely. He tried to laugh it off, a weak, shaky sound. "Well, damn, guess I stepped in it, huh?" No one laughed with him. Helen leaned back, crossing her arms, her eyes still on him like he was a sideshow. The whispers around them grew louder. "That's her, Trump's press girl. He's such an ass." And James felt the walls closing in. He'd wanted to embarrass her, make her squirm, but now he was the one squirming. Karoline, meanwhile, went back to her notes, immigration stats, Tampa briefing, Trump's next move, like the chaos around her didn't exist. James rubbed his neck, his mind racing. He should apologize, right? That's what a decent guy would do. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with pride and humiliation. Instead, he doubled down, grasping at straws. "Okay, fine, you're a big deal, but come on, you don't exactly scream White House sitting there all quiet like that." It was a dumb thing to say, desperate, petty, and he knew it the second it left his mouth. Karoline didn't even glance at him this time. "Maybe you're just not listening," she said, soft but pointed, and kept typing. Helen snorted, shaking her head. James sank lower in his seat, his chest tight. He'd picked a fight with the wrong person, and now the whole cabin was watching him crash and burn. He wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. Not for another hour, not until this plane touched down. And Karoline, she just kept working, serene as ever. like she'd already won without lifting a finger. James Carver felt the air shift, heavy with judgment pressing in from every corner of the first-class cabin. The whispers started low at first, a ripple of murmurs among the passengers. But they grew sharper, more pointed. "What a jerk," someone muttered a few rows back. "Can you believe this guy?" another voice hissed. Then came the shout, loud and unfiltered, from a burly man in a polo shirt near the front. "Who the hell does he think he is, talking to Ms. Leavitt like that?" Heads turned. Eyes locked on James, pinning him in place. His throat tightened. The confidence he'd carried onto this flight, the swagger of a man who'd fought his way to the top, melted away, leaving him exposed, isolated, a fool in a room full of witnesses. He sank lower in his seat, hands gripping the armrests. The cabin wasn't big, but it felt suffocating now. Every glance a jab, every whisper a knife. Helen Grayson across the aisle didn't bother hiding her smirk, her magazine forgotten as she watched him squirm. The guy 2 rows up shook his head, muttering something to his seatmate that ended in a low laugh. James caught snippets, arrogant, clueless, deserves it, and each word stung worse than the last. He'd wanted to put Karoline in her place, make her feel small, but now he was the one shrinking, drowning in the fallout of his own big mouth. His mind raced, clawing for something to hold on to. He'd always prided himself on reading people, knowing who mattered, who didn't, who was worth his time. It'd gotten him this far, hadn't it? But now, staring at Karoline, still tapping away at her tablet unfazed, he wasn't so sure. Memories crept in, unbidden and unwelcome. That kid he'd fired 5 years back, a scrawny tech whiz he'd pegged as lazy, turned out to be a genius who'd built a startup worth millions. The quiet woman he'd brushed off as a nobody at a conference. She'd gone on to ink a deal that left his firm in the dust. He'd been wrong before. A lot. And now, sitting next to Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, he'd blown it again. Badly. He rubbed his face, exhaling hard. Maybe he should say something, fix this before it got worse. He turned to her, forcing the words out, awkward and halting. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you, okay? It's just, you don't look like, someone important." The second it left his mouth, he knew it was wrong. Clumsy, stupid, digging the hole deeper. Karoline stopped typing. She set her tablet down and looked at him, her gaze cold, piercing, like she could see right through him. "So what does someone important look like in your world?" she asked, her voice low, steady, but loaded with steel. James froze. Mouth half open, no answer ready. What was he supposed to say? That he'd expected her to strut in with a power suit and a loud title? That he'd built his whole life on snap judgments? Clothes, posture, volume, and she'd just shattered that lens? He fumbled, grasping for words that wouldn't come. You're so young and quiet and..." He trailed off, his voice weak, pathetic even to his own ears. Karoline didn't blink. "You don't know me," she said, echoing her earlier line, but this time it hit harder, a quiet accusation he couldn't dodge. Helen Grayson chimed in, her tone dry as sandpaper. "She's not just young and quiet, Mr. Carver. She worked for Elise Stefanik, cut her teeth in Congress, then ran for it herself in 22. Lost, sure, but came back swinging as Trump's press lead. That's not luck or daddy's money. That's work." James's stomach twisted. He vaguely remembered the name now, Stefanik, the New York rep, tough as nails. Karoline had been in that orbit? Run for Congress at 25? And then taken on the White House press corps? He'd called her a brat, a nobody, when she'd already climbed mountains he'd never even tried. The tension peaked, a silent scream in his chest. He couldn't justify this. Not to her, not to Helen, not to the dozen pairs of eyes still burning into him. "I didn't know," he muttered, barely audible, a last-ditch plea. Karoline tilted her head, her expression unyielding. "You didn't ask," she said, simple and brutal, then picked up her tablet again. James slumped back, defeated. He'd spent half this flight tearing her down, and she'd dismantled him without raising her voice. The cabin's judgment, his own doubts, her quiet truth, it all crashed down, leaving him with nothing to say, no way out. Just the bitter taste of being dead wrong. The plane touched down in Tampa, and James Carver lingered in his seat, rattled but desperate to salvage something. As Caroline stood to grab her bag, he cleared his throat. "Hey, do you ever forgive guys like me?" he asked, his voice small. She paused, turning with a faint smile, not warm but not cruel. "I don't hold grudges," she said, "but you should watch what you say." Her words were light, almost kind, and James nodded, relieved, thinking maybe he'd dodged the worst of it. He stepped into the airport, reaching for his carry-on, only to find it gone. Panic hit, his wallet, keys, everything stolen. He spun around, scanning the crowd, then caught a smirk from the guy 2 rows up, slipping away with a familiar bag. It clicked. While he'd been tearing into Caroline, someone had taught him a lesson. She'd seen it. Her seat gave her the perfect view, but said nothing, just walked off with that cryptic smile. James stood frozen, pride shattered, possessions lost. Caroline vanished into the throng, leaving him wondering, did she plan this? His arrogance had cost him more than he'd ever imagined. James Carver's flight taught him a brutal truth. Arrogance blinds us to others' worth, and snap judgments can cost more than pride. He saw Karoline Leavitt as a nobody, only to lose everything, his dignity, his bag, his certainty, because he couldn't see past his own assumptions. In life, we do this too often, labeling people by their looks or status, missing the talent, grit, or quiet strength beneath. Slowing down, asking questions, listening, it's how we avoid James's fate. Next time you're quick to judge, pause. You might be sitting next to someone who will surprise you. Thanks for flying with us through this story. We hope it sparked some thoughts. What's your take? Ever misjudged someone and regretted it? Drop your stories in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going and learn from each other.